My name is Homi Karas. I'm the co-director of the Global Economy and Development Program here at Brookings. And today we are going to talk about education and learning for a changing world. It's really a launch of the new World Bank World Development Report called Learning to Realize Education's Promise. So the basic structure is that we're going to start with a short presentation of the WDR. Then we're going to have a panel discussion. I'll introduce the panelists at that time, and then I'll open it up for Q&A, and we'll aim to be out of here at about 11 o'clock. So let me first introduce the co-directors and co-presenters of this year's WDR. First, Dion Filmer. Dion has been in the research department of the World Bank. We were talking beforehand. This is his third World Development Report, so he has become a kind of a professional and regular at writing these things. Maybe you can ask him afterwards what actually gets achieved from these wonderful documents. He's spent many years in research. He has spent much of his career at the World Bank in the Africa region. He's focused on human capital and skills. He has co-authored a couple of books, Making Schools Work, New Evidence from Accountability Reforms, Youth Employment in Sub-Saharan Africa. Dion Filmer is one of the co-directors. The other co-director is, and Dion will start the presentation and then hand over to his fellow co-director, Halsey Rogers. Halsey has also been in the research department. He's currently in the education global practice of the World Bank. He has authored the World Bank's Education Strategy 2020, Learning for All. He's focused on teacher effectiveness, service delivery, aid development effectiveness, and was advisor to at least two, but I suspect more, World Bank chief economists, including Joe Stiglitz and Nick Stern. Dion, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Homi, and thank you all for being here. So in East Africa, when third graders were asked to read the sentence, "The name of the dog is Puppy," only 25% of them could understand what that meant, which means that 75% did not. In rural India, when third graders were asked to solve this two-digit subtraction, again, about three-quarters of them could not. And by the fifth grade, only half could do this. In Brazil, which is often considered a fairly decently performing country in the realm of education, the PISA results have gone up from 2003 to 2015. But it'll take them 75 years to reach the OECD average at the current pace for mathematics. For reading, it'll take more than 260 years. And these aren't just isolated anecdotes. If we take all the learning assessments that have been done around the world, try to harmonize them, put them on the same scale, set a minimum threshold, minimum proficiency threshold, see in these high-income countries, over 90% of kids exceed that threshold. Expand out to other countries, as well in high-income countries, middle and low-income countries, you see the proportion of kids who reach that threshold falls dramatically. This is the learning crisis. In Japan, 98% of kids reach this minimum proficiency level. In Mali, only 7% of primary school students do. And this learning crisis isn't just a levels story. It's also an inequality story. So this just shows from one learning assessment in Latin America, these gaps between rich and poor. And in Uruguay, for example, the proportion of kids who are deemed not competent on this terce exam or test is 5 times greater in the poorer than the richest quintile.
So what is driving this learning crisis? there are two sets of answers. The first is these proximate causes, what's going on at the level of the school, the community, the student. So first of all, students are often arriving to school unprepared to learn if they're able to arrive to school at all. One indication of this is what happens when children are malnourished, when they don't get the support they need, when they're stunted, when they don't get the early stimulation they need before they arrive at school. Here's some new evidence from brain scans of infants in Bangladesh, which shows the difference between children who have proper nutrition and those who have deprivation, who are malnourished. And we see there's an actual visible difference in the density of neural connections. And so these students are arriving, if they ever get to school, they're arriving at a disadvantage when it comes to being able to learn because of poverty. Secondly, teachers. Teachers in many of these systems are either not skilled, not prepared to teach, or aren't given the motivation or the support to make sure they're in the classroom. Here's an example. On any random and any typical day in these 8 African countries where surveys have been done, 20% of teachers who are supposed to be teaching on that day are not even in the school when they're supposed to be teaching. Another 20% are in the school, but they are not in the classroom teaching. So you're losing 40% of teaching time. A third indicator is of the quality of management. So these are very challenging circumstances that these schools are working in. Often the management is not up to the challenge. And we have some new data from interesting research on the management scores. They've gone in and assessed the quality of management and management practices in random samples of schools across many countries, a number of countries. We see here, this is the distribution in the United States and Canada, where a higher score is a better score, and the green indicates the distribution of school management quality. You see that in middle income and lower income countries, the distribution has shifted well to the left. The management scores are much lower in those schools in those countries. They're also lower in schools in those countries than in the manufacturing sector in those very same countries, which is indicated by the blue line. So there's a real problem with management. But those are the proximate causes, what we can think of as the micro causes at the school and community level. Why are these problems allowed to persist? Now, one reason is barriers to learning at scale, at the level of the system. We find that there are 2 sets of barriers that prevent solutions at the school level from either being sustainable or scalable. One is technical complexity. It's very challenging. For example, if you make a desirable change to the curriculum that should improve learning, but you need to match that with a change in teacher preparation, in-service teacher education, in student assessment to reflect the new curriculum, in teacher evaluation to reflect the ability to implement the new curriculum. And what that means is that it's very complex. Often the implementation capacity is not there. So that's one challenge at the system level. But secondly, is political economy. Often the politics is not aligned toward a focus on learning. There are many, each of the key actors in an education system or surrounding an education system has many interests. One of these interests may be learning or is learning, but there are other interests as well. Politicians want to be reelected, bureaucrats want to keep their jobs, often to make politicians satisfied. Educators have to make the bureaucrats happy. Parents have other interests beyond just focusing on the children's learning. So there are a variety of interests. Problem is that often in these low-performing systems, these other interests dominate, and learning does not become a priority, particularly learning for all, learning with equity, often falls well down on the list of priorities. And so the system is not organized to deliver learning for all. So systems are stuck in what you can think of as a low learning, low accountability, high inequality equilibrium, or more simply, a low learning trap.
But as we argue in the report, not all is lost. There are a number of examples around the world of systems breaking out of these traps or exceeding expectations, both over the long haul, like in Korea, surprising country like Vietnam when it emerged in 2012 as having a PISA test score on par with Germany, or more micro approaches such as in Liberia, Papua New Guinea, or Tonga, where where reading ability was really increased dramatically in a very short span of time. So what do we argue in the report you can do to actually face this learning crisis? Well, countries need to take action showing that learning really matters to them. We have to move beyond the rhetoric of learning and actually move to action. And we outlined three key entry points as to how you can do that. First, assess learning to make it a serious goal. When the UIS went and did an assessment of which countries had what it took to monitor the SDG indicators for learning at the end of primary and lower secondary levels, only 50% of countries actually had data that you could know where these countries stood on those SDGs. And fewer still had the data systems capable of tracking that over time. Second, countries have to act on evidence to make schools work for all learners. This is the action at the at the school level. This mirrors what Halsey was describing as the proximate or the immediate causes of the learning crisis. And here we follow that same decomposition of effects with learning at the center. Ensure that learners are prepared and motivated, acting in the early years with demand-side incentives and more generally preparing with the appropriate stimulation. So here, for example, a fairly well-known example from Jamaica, early child stimulation enabling children to learn better resulted 20 or 30 years down the line with 25% higher earnings for those children and lower crime rates and other salutary effects. Teacher preparation, ensuring that teachers are skilled and motivated through effective professional development. The idea here, one of the guiding principles we have, is closing the gap, or the gaps between what happens in practice and what this new wealth of evidence that we now have suggests should be done. We see a number of cases where there's a large gap between those two. The idea is to close those gaps. Teacher professional development is actually one of the places we see that there's a huge gap between what the evidence suggests should be done with in class, with mentoring, with follow-up action with teachers, and the typical professional development program which takes teachers out of the classroom, sends them away, perhaps for a day, sends them back to the classroom with no follow-up. So here, for example, in Liberia, a training program, a professional development program that taught teachers how to assess students and then use that assessment to then tailor their teaching to those students, more than doubled students' reading fluency in a very short period of time. Ensure that when it comes to the other factors at the school level, either school inputs or even school management, really what we want to do is focus on that teacher-learning relationship, teacher-learner relationship. Too often we see inputs that come in aren't actually complementary to that teaching-learning relationship and detract from it. And as we argue in the report, to be effective, inputs really need to go through there. For example, adaptive learning, which is sort of a bit of the rage right now, is a very effective program in India, which because it's adaptive software, it could teach at the level of the student, really helping that learning relationship more than doubled, and that's the conservative estimate. By other estimates, tripled the students' rate of learning. We also have a chapter in the report that focuses on the sort of more jobs-facing part of the education system and preparing kids for training and what kind of training makes job training is most effective. And here we argue that it's really the flexibility, but most importantly, the engagement with employers that makes those kinds of activities effective.
At the same time, I'm done. Next one. If you're going to promote learning with equity, learning for all at the system level, we need to also tackle the problem at the system level. The kinds of innovations that Deanna's talked about at school level are more likely to happen often in the schools that are already better equipped, that are better linked to evidence, to accountability, et cetera. So those that, if we really want to make things happen at the system level, we have to make sure this happens throughout the system by aligning actors to make the whole system work for learning. This is a complicated area, but we have some ideas, and this is going to be even more context dependent than what Dion's talked about. Always these solutions have to be adapted to context, but some entry points that we see from the successful experiences are using information and metrics, coalitions and incentives, and innovation and agility to try to escape these low learning traps. Information and metrics. So one example in Tanzania, you had a combination of various new sources of information. You had falling school-leaving exam scores, but that was complemented by new information from citizen-led assessments by the NGO UEZO that showed very low levels of learning among young children. You had service delivery indicators showing a very poor quality of service delivery in schools. Together, those created political pressure for action that then led to the big results now in education reform program that really works across the various dimensions that we've talked about to try to promote learning for all. In coalitions and incentives, the key is to build coalitions for learning and learning for all. There are different ways of doing this. One example in Chile, you see an increasing focus on learning for all over the long term, thanks to long-term negotiated reform process, working with the teachers' unions to build confidence, to have opt-in reforms that gradually introduce some of the types of innovations that Dion has talked about at the micro level throughout the system. And then finally, innovation and agility. As I mentioned, these solutions are always going to be very context dependent. You're not going to be able to import ideas from anywhere, no matter how well thought out, and apply them in your own system. What you can do, we argue, is look for inspiration elsewhere, take ideas into your own system, try something, but then innovate in an agile way, make sure there's a feedback loop to learn from those. For example, we give in Burundi, in a post-conflict setting, when textbooks were very scarce, Burundi used an adaptive approach to successfully dramatically cut down the distribution time for textbooks to schools there by learning from the better performing parts of the system and then applying that across the system. So they were able to cut the textbook distribution time for the whole system down from a year to 60 days.
So in very short summary, what we argue is countries should be striving to achieve an aligned system that focuses on learning by assessing learning to make it a serious goal. Second, by acting to make all schools work for learners, and by aligning the actors in the system to make the whole system work for learning. Thank you.
Thank you.